that are here today are from a firm called PricewaterhouseCoopers, which of course is a firm of chartered accountants. And these two individuals at one time were both members of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Mr. Glen Harloff is the Vice President of Dispute Analysis and Investigations Group of Pricewaterhouse. He was a member of the RCMP for 21 years, of which the last 9 years were with the Toronto Commercial Crime Section. Mr. Harloff conducted complex national and international fraud, bankruptcy, secret commission, conflict of interest, proceeds of crime or money laundering, and other criminal investigations. And from 91 to 93, he was with the Bank of Montreal, performing duties as an internal auditor with the Corporate Audit Treasury Group. And he conducted audits which included international operations, foreign exchange, money market, securities, international payments, MasterCard, which is, of course, the credit card, and domestic operations. Mr. Harloff joined Pricewaterhouse in 1996, and he specializes in financial investigations in criminal and civil matters. Mr. Haywood was also a member of the RCMP. For 24 years, he was involved in a wide range of criminal and fraud investigations. And after several years investigating major criminal occurrences, Mr. Haywood was an investigator and supervisor in the commercial crime section. And he conducted various types of investigations. He has a lot of experience in bankruptcy, counterfeit, currency, financial instruments, insurance fraud, and business frauds. And both of these gentlemen are trained in accounting, trained in fraud investigation. Mr. Haywood is a certified fraud examiner. Those of you who are familiar with the term know that fraud examiners are the people who come in and find fraud in various types of transactions. We're very fortunate to have both gentlemen here today. They were also speakers at the Institute of Law Clerks Fellowship course. They have a very interesting presentation with lots of good stories about frauds and scams. So there's everything you wanted to know about forensic accounting. We dealt first with the mind, now we're dealing with money. So I leave it to these two gentlemen. Thank you. Red light's on, then you're on.
Okay, thanks, Elliot. You certainly put a lot of pressure on us here. Tell everything about fraud in an hour and a half, but we'll see what we can do. First of all, the group here, just to get an idea of who's here. Do we have, you're all working in forensic accounting or accounting issues? None? Do we have any, couple? Do we have any accountants here? Couple? Okay. All right, everybody else is law related? All right. This is going to be reasonably general because we're going to try and cover some of the issues, but how you could use a forensic accountant for court or for investigations, and go through. What we're going to deal with is, we'll talk about what is a forensic accountant. Excuse me, sir. Just going to turn your mic on. There we go. Different red. Is that better? Okay. We're going to talk about the role of forensic accountant, and then we're going to go through some examples because I think it's easier by case example to tell you some of the things that you can use a forensic accountant for rather than just listing the things off.
First thing we find useful is to clarify some definitions. The term forensic, you can see from the title of our practice for disputes analysis and investigations, we're not specifically forensic anymore. I'd just like to put the screen up to clarify that forensic is anything to do with the law, any kind of investigation or inquiry. In this case, it's accounting. It tends to have a very vague meaning, and I find that people don't know specifically what we're talking about. And we want you to know when to use our services. Next slide, Glenn.
Okay. We know that you covered forensic, and I looked through some of the material from Peter Collins. He covered a lot of that, so we'll go through.
Same thing with investigative. It's another term that tends to be vague. I think we all investigate in our everyday lives. The best investigator to me is my wife when one of my children arrives home late from some appointment. She's an excellent interrogator in those circumstances and certainly an investigator. But for us, we're using our skills and experience in the accounting field and in our business backgrounds and relating that experience to the law. What are the legal problems here? What are the potential legal problems? How can we analyze and gather information to be used in that domain?
Okay. When we combine these things, we combine an accountant and investigations, we get to what we refer to as a forensic accountant. Now, there's no such thing as a forensic accountant. You won't find a designation. It's a term that's developed, but really it's what I call getting to the middle. So some people start as an accountant over here, and others start as an investigator over here. Well, Ray and I started as investigators, but over the years we worked towards the middle. So we developed accounting skills dealing with financial investigations, and what I call getting to the middle, where you're an investigator with financial knowledge and know how to deal with financial matters. The accountant can do the same thing, only he has to develop, he's got the accounting skills, he has to develop his investigative skills. So eventually when you do get to the middle, you have what I refer to as a forensic accountant. And you're going to be involved in examination of various civil and criminal elements. There's a high probability the results will be subject to court proceedings, so you may end up testifying. Whatever work you do may be ending up in disclosure or before the courts. But the bottom line is you're really determining what really occurred here. And that's the key, is you're trying to figure out what happened. It may involve providing expert testimony relating to a series of transactions or other activities or missing records. A lot of our cases, records are missing, and that's where the real issues start. If we had a lovely set of books and everything was there, these things would be probably very simple. Normally you inherit what I call a mess, and you start from there, and it usually ends up going downhill because you're trying to piece something together, and it's a matter of going internally, going externally, just finding everything it gets to put the puzzle together. You might be used for forensic evaluations, forensic appraisals, insurance claims, investigations that require specific specialized designation and/or expertise. So in some cases you may need a forensic person who knows trading, commodities, various other things. I always put derivatives down there. Does anybody understand derivatives? Anybody that doesn't understand derivatives? That's what I like to see. You remember the case with Barings Bank where a guy by the name of Nick Leeson over in Asia who brought the entire bank down through derivatives, and nobody understood it. The bank didn't understand it. The auditors obviously didn't understand, internal or external, and as a result, he was the expert in derivatives, and he brought the entire bank down. So you need people who know how things work. And that's one of the keys, is finding out which type of person you need. Just want to talk a little bit about an auditor versus forensic accountant. And when something goes wrong in a company, of course, the first thing they look at is the auditors. Why didn't the auditors find that? And it's not the role of audit to find fraud. Okay? Audit deals with what we call GAAP, is generally accepted accounting principles, and GAS, which are generally accepted auditing standards. So in other words, they're going to go in and they're going to look at a company with the purpose of giving an opinion on the financial statements. And they're going to use GAAP and GAS as basically the rules. So they have to do certain things have to be done this way. They're going to follow those rules. They're going to ensure that the company is following those rules. They have what you would call a materiality level. So in other words, depending on the size of the company, if it's $1 billion company, their materiality level may be $1 million, maybe higher than that. So in other words, as long as the financial statements that they report at year end are within $1 million, that's close enough. Okay? Because they can't look at every transaction. They're going to do sampling. Okay? So if they looked at every transaction, they'd be there for years. There's pressure to get it done within a short time period because there's reporting requirements. They don't necessarily the company can't afford to have all this staff from PricewaterhouseCoopers or any other accounting firm come in and spend months there auditing and going through the books. So really what they're doing is they're doing a materiality, a sampling, and they're going to express opinion on the financial statements of management that they're fairly stated. And that's in very general terms the role of audit. Now when you get into forensic accounting, what we do is we're focused. We'll come in, we're identifying specific issues. And it may be expenses. It may be some other area. It may be a specific accounting issue. It may be a fraud related to inventory. But we're focused on inventory. We have no materiality level. So a $10, if we see an invoice for $10 and it doesn't make sense, we may follow up that $10 because that's going to help us put the puzzle together and explain what's happened here. That $10 may lead to another 10, which may lead to another 10, which will lead to 100. I was doing a company a couple years ago where just going through the checks, and there was a check in a Canadian company, check written in US dollars, which was just to cash. Nice round numbers, $2,000. I thought, well, this is kind of strange. Why would you do that? You know, you have petty cash, but it's in US, you're a Canadian company. So one of the things when we set up at the beginning, let's pull all the checks that are written to cash. And over 2 years, when we finished, we had a list of checks, and it was $1.5 million. US dollars that all went out to cash in just under 2 years. So the one check led to a big issue. Under an audit materiality, they may have seen the one check, said, that's okay. You know, if it was recorded right, that's fine, and not looked further. And we're not giving an opinion on the financial statements. We have nothing to do with financial statements. We're focused on a particular issue. The one thing about audit as well, that when we focus, of course, everything is easy to see in hindsight. And when you look at it and you find this, for instance, you find the $1.5 million in cash. So the first question of everybody is, well, why didn't audit find it? So then we have to go back to what's the role of audit? What did management tell audit?
One of the things we want to point out with audit, making a distinction with audit, if you're just doing internal inquiries for a client or if you're working for a company, this is a place for people who have done things they should not have done to go and hide. Auditors are reviewers and reporting only. It's not their function to prevent, it's not their function to punish or to sort out the problems. So we find with business investigations, one of the biggest challenges is to get rid of the side issues and the things that don't really matter and focus on what the problem is here. And oftentimes they'll drag the audit group in, and there's all this discussion and argument about the auditor's roles. What they do is review and report. That's it.
Okay, I'll just run down this quickly, and then we're going to talk about some examples later on this particular case. But employment issues. That's probably one of the key things that we get involved in, which involves legal counsel because you have labor issues. You end up with a dishonest employer. You've got the dismissal issues, and this is probably one of the key parts, because you know through cases and through the law, if things are not done right, then you may have a bad employee that's taken money from a company, and he ends up getting a nice severance package just because he wasn't dismissed properly or things were not done in a proper fashion, and that tends to upset companies even more. So that's one of the key issues we look at. Litigation and support, class action. These types of issues, the market is, I call it brutal. If you have a company and your earnings don't meet the expectations of the market, you know, your shares are just are going to go down. So on the class action, you often get involved in cases like that where you would go through and analyze what's happened to the shares. And there's a lot of reasons for it. It's not just a fraudulent action. Often you have cases that just the market has gone down, or that type of industry has gone down, or there's been other things that cause it. So we look at those things. Regulatory, government grants, things like that. Are you following the proper procedures? As an example, some of the HRDC issues that are coming up now. Okay, there's certain things to follow. There's film grants seem to be a key issue right now. Get involved in due diligence, risk assessment. So in other words, following up some of the things that have happened with companies, the types of things you get involved in, looking ahead. Again, we'll cover that in a bit. Valuations. In criminal situations, use a forensic accountant for a couple of issues. One, of course, is to help the Crown support the case. Another is on defense. We've done several cases where the defense has come to us and presented us with a brief, forensic accountant brief, and asked us to go through it and just to evaluate what is in there, the methods, and comment on the position of his client. In some cases, you know, I've gone through ones where I've said, you know, here's an issue and here's an issue. In others, I've gone back and said, I think your client has a problem. But what it does do is allows legal counsel to make a decision on how they're going to treat the case. I have a note down here, and I'll throw this one in for a case now, because a couple years ago, I got a call from legal counsel, and he said he has a client that's been accused by the banks of kiting. Does everyone understand what kiting is? It's just, well, it's basically creating money. You're moving money from one account to another, and you're moving it so fast that the accounts never catch up. And in this case, he asked if we'd go in and look at the company and help his client out. So I went in there, and as soon as I walked in the door, I said, this isn't right. And it reminded me of the cases that Ray and I did in telemarketing. As soon as we walk in the door, I said, this isn't a normal business. You've got somebody at the front desk, a girl, writing things in handwriting on paper, and there's no office, nothing on the walls. I said, something going on here. Anyway, went back in. There was another guy sitting at the computer, and he was monitoring the 3 bank accounts they had on a steady basis. So this is another sign that says, hey, this doesn't seem to be quite right. In the end, I spent about a day and a half there, and the company had bank accounts in Montreal, in Toronto, and one in the U.S. Now, the U.S. is great because it takes about 7 or 8 days to clear a check from the States. So in order to do a kite, you need time. If you do it in Canada, Canada's pretty good now. Most of it's overnight clearing. So if you have 2 Canadian bank accounts, it's hard to do it. It can be done, but it's hard to do it. So in this case, the money was going from Toronto. You'd write a check payable to the Montreal account, and of course that money would get deposited there. And then you'd write a check to the U.S., and that money would get deposited there by check. And then you'd write in the U.S., you'd write a check to the Toronto account, and that wouldn't clear for 8 days. So now we've got some time. So quick analysis, and we're up to about $4 million. So there's $4 million that just wasn't there. It was all caught up in the circle. So in that case, it was back to legal counsel, explain the facts, and said, that's all we can do for you. There are the facts, you deal with it, which he did. He dealt with it very quickly, actually. We do get involved in security of assets and tracing of assets, tracing money, various accounts offshore. Money moves fast. I did a case a couple years ago that the money was missing, and by the time it took us about a month to find the first spot, and the first spot was in Montreal. But by the time it finished, that money went from Montreal to Chicago to Turks and Caicos to Switzerland to Austria, and then it got split in Austria. Some came back to the States, some came back to Toronto, and some went to Israel. And that had all happened before we even started the investigation. And each step took about 2 or 3 months because you have to go to the banks, you have to follow it through. So you can never catch up to the money. So that's how fast it can move. It can be going around, it'll be around the world in a day. And we also look at procedures and processes.
Just to sum up, if you think of forensic accountants and investigations, we want you to not only think of it in terms of fraud investigations or litigation support investigations. There's always a whole series of issues that can affect the company. If you're acting as external counsel or internal counsel to them, we can be of use, people that do these kinds of do this kind of work. And as Glenn said, it can be regulatory, it can be an employment issue, compliance, policies and procedures, any of those things. Anything that requires gathering of evidence, gathering of information, analyzing it, and putting it into usable form.
This is really the bottom line: who, what, where, how. And you need this. It really boils down to one thing. It's an informed business decision. And you can't make that without having the facts. Okay, so whether you're going to ask to do a forensic investigation, whether it's a civil process, a criminal, an employee being dismissed, a civil action against employees, all these issues really involve knowing what happened and making that decision. And what we report is good and bad. Okay, so it's not just the facts that are going to help you. You're going to get all the facts. When you're looking at getting involved in a forensic investigation, first thing you have to look up front is legal considerations and engagement. And put this in because, sure, the legal counsel here, on solicitor-client privilege, it's got to be set up from the start. And if it isn't, then, of course, you can never get it back. You can't decide halfway through. So these are some of the issues you have to address at the start. If you're going to engage a forensic accountant, are you going to engage it through legal counsel? Or is it going to be engaged directly by the client? Engagement letter, what kind of details are you going to put in? Now, I've seen an engagement letter that basically said, I am being engaged to look at accounts and confirm that Ray Haywood stole $100,000. And it wasn't Ray, but there is an actual engagement letter like that. So if you ever go to court, you're done, because there's no objectivity there. The way it should have read is, I've been engaged to examine certain financial records to determine if funds were stolen, and if so, to quantify what was stolen and who may be responsible. So you could do something along that nature. But when you've already focused, it's done. You also set up the reporting procedures, how you're going to deal with working papers, drafts, and final reports. And one of the cases we've been involved in is you end up in these issues, and you get a lot of other agencies being involved. So in other words, doing a case now where we've got the OSC involved, or the OSC has an interest, I should say. The SEC has an interest. There's a class action lawsuit going on. There's a civil action against certain employees or former employees of the company. And there's also a criminal investigation by the police. So you have all these people, and the facts are basically, they're all going to use the same facts. But what comes in, if you haven't set it up ahead of time and you don't have all legal counsel working together, and you're going to have different legal counsel on this, is that they may have different interests. And you don't want on the company's behalf to be arguing a situation for both sides. So you've really got to get together and decide the strategy. Like if I do a forensic report for a certain issue, is that going to be released? And who's it going to be released to? and how does it affect the privilege issues. So there's all things that need to be considered up front.
One of the tools we developed at PricewaterhouseCoopers it was developed because of the litigation our own firm faces. As I'm sure all of you are aware, it's not uncommon now that if there's a major business failure, you look around for whoever's left standing upright and has money in their pocket. And oftentimes that's a large accounting firm or a law firm or some other professional group that acted on behalf of the company. So as a self-defense, or what evolved out of all these situations we've dealt with over the years is this area we've called problem practice management. How many of you as counsel for a company have had a panic phone call from somebody in the senior executive that there's a serious problem? Someone's been caught, there's money missing, or there's some other serious problem involving an employee of theirs. Have you had that situation? Because we find that where they turn is their internal counsel or their external counsel immediately, and they're looking for answers. The other thing we noted, and we were doing it ourselves, is after the initial panic's over and everyone's calmed down and you sort of assess the situation, you have to make a decision whether you're going to put any time and money into looking any further into it, or you're going to wait for the plaintiffs to come forward and litigate. And the practice has been generally to wait. What we're suggesting with this tool is that you take a proactive approach. That when you've identified a situation, you know there's a problem, you take some steps to get yourself prepared. In our case, we were the auditors for a company. The company failed. We could see that there was a problem coming up. The first thing, there's 4 steps. The first one is to make a preliminary assessment. And I think that speaks for itself. You review and assess the situation. You look at what really happened here. You sort through the issues. Where is our risk? What are we exposed to legally? Who might be the persons or parties that are going to be plaintiffs against our company or our firm? The second thing we do is to establish a response team, and this goes to the issue of privilege. When we're establishing a response team, we always involve our own counsel and most of the time external counsel to discuss the issue of privilege. If we feel that we want to protect the information, and most times we do, then we'll engage counsel and report to counsel and run all our investigative reports through that person. We also establish a team. Our counsel sets out formal procedures, establishes a team which will include whatever you need, an accountant, an investigator, whatever specialized people you need. We restrict the information and we restrict meetings and conversation to the team. They're instructed not to go outside with any of the information they received. They're instructed not to discuss the case. We protect the privilege issue right from the beginning. This is prior to anyone coming and approaching us or informing us that we are going to be subject to litigation. We establish reporting procedures, protocols, and timeframes. As Glenn said, we discuss how we want to report it, what do we want to have in the working files, and where is it going to be stored. We also agree to mark all the working papers, all the investigative files with the privilege, with some kind of an indication that these are privileged documents. And we take the necessary physical security steps. Just after I left the RCMP, I worked for an insurance company here in Toronto. And one of the things that happened to that company was their chief executive officer got himself in quite a predicament. He had a very nice wife and family, and he had another person, a woman on the side who was his most senior executive of the company. And when the wife found out about all this stuff, she created a problem for him. And they ended up having a major inquiry conducted by a law firm from Los Angeles. And there was no written report ever produced from this investigation. When I came on about a year after this occurred, there was all kinds of innuendo that the written report had been hidden. I ended up talking to a couple of the senior partners from Los Angeles a couple of years later, and they said in that case, it was their advice to their clients, and their clients accepted this, that there would be no written report for that investigation. And he said, generally, we do not produce written reports in our office in Los Angeles for this type of an inquiry. There was 2 reasons. One is the report would have been that thick. There was a whole bunch of really juicy items in this thing. It involved all kinds of misbehaviors. So a report this thick, when they were going to the board of directors, they thought would only serve to put them all to sleep. What they did was did an overhead show with slides, and these people that have been involved in these unsavory activities, have been foolish enough to take photographs of each other. So they included those, and it had the desired effect on the board, and this fellow was fired along with some other people. But the main point, they said, was we refused to create the plaintiff's case and hand it to them in discovery. Let them go make their own case. Anyways, that was their method of doing it, and I think that's something that's it's something we consider when we're developing these things. We are creating a report on our own situation, but it's discussed how we're going to report it and those other issues. The third step is to collect the information and investigate. We do that very discreetly, and it's confidential. We do not do an overt investigation at that point, necessarily. Again, why would I want to alert potential plaintiffs and their counsel that I'm concerned? And the fourth stage is to, one point I want to make when we're collecting information and conducting our investigation. We take steps to protect the records that we feel are at risk in our own company. So for an audit, the working papers and those kinds of documents were turned over to counsel. We made photocopies, kept them in our office. We informed our own staff that if they're approached by search warrant or other legal means, that they're to go to external counsel. The objective was not to conceal or hide the information. The objective of that step is to control it. One of the problems with criminal search warrants, for instance, you lose control of the documents once the police have seized them, and if they're entered in court, the documents are completely out of control and are almost a public record. We take these steps at first, just consider what can happen, what are the possibilities, and how do we adjust for that. The last step is to finalize the case management strategy. We also conduct some interviews during the investigative phase of it. If things happen today, and you have audit staff, we have about a 25 to 30% turnover rate in our firm. Most accounting firms do. We don't want 2 years later, when the plaintiff comes forward, to have to go and find these people. There are ways to do a very discreet and just a procedural interview to gather all the information you possibly can. The last stage is the finalize the case management strategy. We gather the information, we meet with our counsel, we've invoked privilege, we've got the documents protected, and then we decide issues like if we're approached by the press, who's going to be the contact person, if the police or other authorities approach, who's going to deal with those issues, and just review our protocols and reporting procedures. We're finding that by taking a proactive approach, getting yourself prepared, it's less expensive in terms of, when I say expensive, I'm talking about time as well as money. It also provides you an opportunity to review the procedures and the policies and the things that went on that led to this situation and make some adjustments. So it is, I'm sorry. No, I don't know that. Where it has been tested is we have had plaintiffs come forward and started that part of the process, and it hasn't been a problem.
So that you've been able to take your internal investigation and by suggesting it to the benefit of external counsel, maintain the solicitor-client privilege?
As I recall, the lawyer that worked on this with it said that he was hired by the managing partner of our firm, and that's his client. So by me, I didn't answer to the managing partner when I didn't inquire. I answered to the lawyer, and he advised his client. Whether that stands the test.
No, I just wonder whether that's a successful distinction. I'll be interested to see the end result of it.
Yeah, I don't think it's got to that stage yet.
That's the approach they took, and they felt it was viable if we kept the team tight and there were no leaks, and we could show that how it was gathered, and it wasn't discussed outside, and I didn't go until.
No, I understand the concept. I'm just curious as to
Yeah, but again, solicitor-client privilege only relates to direction from the lawyer, and this has always been a big misconception, because as a policeman, I've done several search warrants on law offices, and of course when you go in there, of course everything is privileged, whatever you touch, so you end up putting everything in boxes, sealing it, and then ending up at the court. But in reality, the only thing that is privileged is what is correspondence or direction you receive from the lawyer or you give the lawyer. So it's back and forth. So trust accounts, documents, all this kind of stuff is not privileged. In fact, the number of times that went to court when we had a hearing after a lawyer office search, and you end up with, I think the last one we had something like 15 boxes. Out of the 15 boxes, we ended up with one letter that was privileged. Okay, and in the end, they ruled it privileged. I don't know what it says, but I'm sure it wasn't that important, because we're looking at everything else is what we really need.
The main benefit of this was that it was fresh, and with counsel we could decide on what are the possibilities and what are the strategies we should employ.
Now, for sure, it strikes me, if you go out and gather the documentation in your office to examine and take your proactive steps, you've done exactly what you were concerned about. It resides in one place after that.
Yep.
Well, there's the plaintiff's case there.
Yeah, but you have put in, and you've what you've done too is you've mitigated such things as all those documents are missing. You know, the old story. It's always the document that's missing is always the most important one. You know, and you know, documents in cases when you wait 6 months, a year, things go missing, but maybe it's more because of they're filed someplace, or somebody else didn't think they were important, or they're sitting in somebody else's desk and he leaves the firm and somebody else looks at it, and you know, there's a lot of reasons for it. There's also reasons that people take them and shred them. But so I'm not in that. But you're doing that, and you're controlling the situation as much as possible. So it'll be interesting in time whether or not.
Our main focus was for us to have a look at them.
Yeah.
And we're under no illusion. There's no way those are protected documents. They're going to be turned over at the end of the day. And as Glenn said, I forgot to mention, things like desk files and that, we find that real important, because even 3 months later, all that stuff's scattered all over the place. And we also do it to protect our own staff. You know, if the police show up or someone shows up with a legal document saying, I'm going to search your office, and they haven't been advised, or there's nobody in place. So anyways, those are the main functions of it.
Okay, when you first start off and you want to get the use of forensic accountant or investigator, really up front you need to know what you want. Do you want strictly an accountant? Do you want is it an investigation? Deal with valuations? Is there an industry expertise required, such as insurance or gaming, construction? And the other thing is a conflict of interest, objectivity and independence. I addressed that a little bit earlier. But for instance, a lot of companies tend to use an internal audit to do an investigation. And that may be good to a certain extent, but if the investigation now involves senior management, or involves the audit committee or the chief financial officer, how relevant is the investigation, and can they look after it? Do they have the skill set? And also with a lot of companies, can companies take the time to investigate? Because everybody else has their normal work that they have to do. They're making the company run. The other thing is you get into such things as did the company do everything possible when something was discovered to investigate it? And that's become a key, especially when you have a public offering later on, and maybe there wasn't full disclosure or something of that nature. So this is where it becomes key, is deciding what you need and who should do it. And this goes back to almost Ray's internal one about the team that you're setting up. The other thing, of course, is cost versus benefit. If you're missing a couple $1,000s, let's not spend $100,000 finding it. Okay? Sometimes you can resolve things very, very quickly. So you've got to look at the extent and what your real objectives are in the end. What are you trying to get at? Determining the issues, and again we've covered a bit of this, but it's really assessing the facts and the circumstances as step one. Trying to decide what really are the allegations and the issues, and the scope of the inquiry. So this is really done at a preliminary stage. So you're going to look and say, what do we think is going on here? How are we going to handle it? What are we going to look at? You're going to decide on the objectives, and this is where you work with the client and legal counsel decide the objectives of the investigation. And again, a lot of these are not individual steps. They're all going to occur together because it may be just an employee issue, but the employee issue can go into insurance and fidelity bonds, because if an employee's taken something, you may have coverage. And this is where a lot of people don't realize it. In insurance cases, often you have coverage that covers an investigation. Litigation and civil action. Are you going to take civil action? Are you gearing this to criminal? Because if you're going to do a forensic investigation in accounting gearing to criminal, then you're going to have to focus and use the criminal rules. So you're going to have to be careful how you gather evidence. Maybe it's just to quantify the loss, and also asset recovery, dealing with Mariva injunctions and trying to recover assets. So in a number of cases, it may be all of these. In other cases, it may be one or two. And you can also do it by stages. Maybe you start off with one and you go out. But at least you need to know what your objectives are to go forward. Gathering of evidence. Look at financial analysis of books and records. Analyzing those books and records and information. Doing background inquiries and intelligence. So if you're looking at something that's possibly a kickback or a vendor, you're going to do research on who this vendor is or who's this guy on the payroll. And also looking at computer systems, because most accounting records now are in computer systems. And it's a heck of a lot easier to go into a system, ask for a read-only password of the accounting system, and go in there and start looking, rather than asking them to pull out their written journals, which are about this big, and try and find an entry. And you can download dozens of things now from the system. You can sort. Most of the systems, like a payable, may be entered by a certain vendor. You can sort through vendors. You can sort through mail, postal codes, all these things you get off the systems. And email. Email is a great place for evidence. Companies need to have policy on email too. Like whose right is it to email? Do the employees have an expectation of privacy? Because if they have an expectation of privacy, there's going to be a certain issue. Then can you look at it? Can you have access to that if they leave, or even while they're still an employee? And these are issues that have to be addressed, and usually up front. Most companies now will have, in fact, an email policy. They'll have policies that say that this is the company's, and we have the right to access it, or we have the right to look at it. So it takes away the expectation of privacy.
These last three slides are probably the biggest challenge when we start a business investigation. What's the objective? What issue do you want to address? And we help the client focus so we don't waste time and effort getting to it. Again, going back to my short time with an insurance company, we had some agents that had done certain acts that we could have turned over to a regulator eventually, or done that kind of an investigation. What we decided in certain cases was the objective was to deal with the employee. There wasn't enough money. They made the client whole again, and everything was looked after. So we investigated to this level so they could deal with the employee and come to an agreement, and that person left the company. The issue was we want to do this much more investigative work to bring it to a package that could be prevented for a criminal fraud case if the loss was $5,000. So how we gathered the evidence, what the objectives were, time, travel, all these other issues were decided. But this is a tricky area, I think, for anyone dealing with a business problem or a business crime.
I just wanted to point, document control becomes a very key issue in here too, because you get into a case that, again, involves the OSC, the SEC, civil action. Everybody wants the same documents. And photocopying is a nightmare. And control of the documents is a nightmare. I started one case where I said, well, where are these documents? And the company had already mailed them down to the SEC or shipped them down to the SEC. So we lost control of them. Not that anything particular is going to happen, but how can you do an investigation? The documents are all over the place. And when the SEC has them, now someone else wants them. So that's something key right up front too, is who's going to handle the documents in one source? How are you going to make sure that you do full disclosure when somebody asks for them? Because the OSC and the SEC have the right to ask for documents, and you want to make sure that you do give them full disclosure, but you want to make sure you're not missing anything. So if documents are all over the place, that can come back to haunt you. Yes?
How much information do you have to have available to you to effectively investigation? Let's say, for example, records, one record is delivered with concealed documents, where do you begin? How can you say he's suspected of giving cash sales, document money? How would you begin the investigation of the documents available?
In that case, I would start with bank statements of his. But the only way you're going to get that, of course, is you may have to go to civil action and demand that he produce such things. Or maybe you'll have to go to credit cards. Maybe you have to go to his wife's accounts. So that's difficult. Let's face it, all the documents is what you need. But again, what you have to work with is usually a different story.
Well, and if the guy's involved in cash business, where he's able to conduct transactions, cash only,
That's
how
it.
effectively
That's extremely difficult. It depends. Is it cash and labor,
well, let's
or is
say-
it?
I'll give you an example of the case I was involved in, where the husband was fabricating parts and machinery, mainly used by the Honda company.
Yeah.
The wife suspected the husband of substantially understating his income for the purposes of matrimony.
Mm-hmm.
What we have is raw materials coming into the shop, but we have no way of tracking exactly how much of that material gets turned into what value of equipment.
Mm-hmm.
All we have is what he reports as sales, and yet we know from anecdotal evidence that he's making a lot of extra money on the side through cash.
Yeah.
So,
Well, you could look at one. Well, you could look at his lifestyle. Okay, how he's living. You could do a net worth. You could, in fact, go out and talk to his sales, who he's making the sales to. It may or may not work. You know, if he's bringing product in, that's a good start because you've got him with so much product, so something's happening to that. But then if he's making cash sales, he should be making some sales to regular people. Start interviewing them. So that's where more of the investigative side comes in, is actually going out, talking to people, making inquiries. You know, maybe you have to look at his day planner. Maybe you have to look at all these other things to say, where's this guy been? What's he doing all day? Maybe you look at his phone records.
We'll also go to the industry. If there's this much material, what can reasonably be expected to be
Yeah.
produced? Those kinds of things.
You could
We
do
have
it-
those situations in our insurance practice where they've done that to the wife, and then they have a car accident and they want to claim with the insurer. So they told the wife their annual income's $20,000. They want to tell the insurer it's $80,000. So we're working it from the other side, trying to say, no, you only made 20.
So, such things as when he goes to the bank for a loan. People are wonderful with things like that because they always have to convince the bank that they're good for the loan. So they have a tendency to list a lot of things on there, and probably most of it is valid, but they'll have a tendency to put on all the shares and what they're doing and recording their income, things like that. So you'll try and find evidence which will contradict what he's saying. But cash business is not easy, and you're probably never going to be absolute, but you can put forward what you can. Okay, do this quick. It's about 5 to 12. So
We don't intend to go into interviewing 101 here. I just wanted to make a few points about it. This, to me, once you get past examining records and those kinds of things, is the most critical skill to anybody investigating or looking into an issue. What's important with interviewing at the start, I believe, is to develop a strategy. How do we want to, how do we want to record these? What medium do we want to use? Do we want notes? Do we want formal written statements? Are we going to videotape? Are we going to audio record interviews? Those kinds of issues. I don't believe you have to videotape every interview you ever did. There's one agency in town here that's in the city here that does regulatory investigations. They've gone that route. That suits their purposes. They're videotaping everything. One thing about audio tape is it has to be transcribed. And if any of you work like us where we have to charge people for the time we put into it, it's like a skidoo. They always say you can drive farther in an hour than you can walk in a day. you audio tape 10 interviews, transcribing would be a problem, and it may not be necessary. What kind of questions? The other strategy you should develop is how we're going to ask questions. If there's 10 witnesses, that we want uniform questions. What are those going to be? Are there issues that we don't want to raise, or are there issues that we have to raise? And always have, we always consider discovery and disclosure. We know that that's going to be an issue at some point. And I can't stress enough the importance of notes. Probably the largest flaw we find in company records and in investigative, both in the police world and in the private world, is a lack of notes. You get phone calls, conversations, pieces of information passed to you. If they're written down on note form and put on your files, you have that information, you have it accurately. So with interviewing, it's always worthwhile to have a discussion with your team and decide on those are the central issues and how we're going to approach this.
Okay, again, you would be the reporting part is the investigative results, schedules, charts, and I'll show you examples in a minute. Something, though, that is useful and understandable, and that's really the key. You can put a lot of schedules in front of people, and you can do all these things, but if they can't understand them, one of the keys with fraud is not simple. Fraud is complex. The more complex you make it, the better for the bad people, because one, probably no one will understand it. Two, the police may not want to investigate, or someone else, private, will not want to investigate because it's too complex. Crown prosecutor or legal counsel may not want to prosecute on it because it's too complex and they don't think they can get a conviction. So the key to all this is to keep it simple, to try and show in as simple a manner as possible what happened and who benefited. And that's not easy, because sometimes you simplify it so much there's no offense left. So it's a difficult thing to do. Searches. Just finished a case using the Anton Pillar order. For those who aren't familiar with the Anton Pillar orders, it's a civil search warrant, and a complainant would go to the court, and it's done in camera, and ask that they have a belief that certain records are in a location, and that they need those records. They feel that they're going to be they could be destroyed, and they're vital to their case, and they'll get an order, and the order will allow them to go to that business or that premises and obtain, normally it'll say obtain copies of those records. Now there's, it'll take me probably half an hour to go through the details in Anton Pillar, but it's an interesting case because it allows you into a business premises. Now, the only thing is, unlike a criminal search warrant, you go in, you basically control the premises. If they tell you to get out, you say, sorry, I'm here. I have a court order. With an Anton Pillar order, you go in, and if the company or the people there do not want to cooperate, you really have no alternative but to leave the premises and go back to the court and say that they're not cooperating, therefore I want you to charge them with contempt. Now that sounds very nice, but it doesn't help you get your documents. So you're kind of stuck in between. And I did a company about 8 months ago where it was very, very stressful in that people obviously didn't want us in there because they had committed a fraud on one of the banks, and we were obtaining the records to support it. And there's a lot of shouting and things like that. Well, the key role was to push far enough that you get your documents and what you need, but not to push far enough that you actually had to leave the premises. And I actually ended up with 3 days there, so it did work. Because I knew, like the contempt thing is, so what? What's it going to get you? So we ended up with the records. There was a lot of arguing going on and things like that. We had to photocopy documents, and then the biggest issue was, well, that's not relevant because they were looking at whatever is written in the Anton Pillar order is only what you can take. Well, it's beyond that. So if it says this invoice, and if there's another invoice that's relevant to that invoice, well, then you're allowed to take it. But that's where some of the issues came in. But it is a very powerful tool. But there's also a liability for the people who ask for the order. So in other words, If you go in and you disrupt a business and you have not disclosed everything to the court and not told the truth on it, something happens to the business, well, then you have to accept the liability. So the legal counsel and the company through legal counsel. So they can be good, but you have to be careful with them. The other thing, I don't know why I missed this point off, but the other point I have to search is, of course, is testifying. And I'm not going to talk about expert witness because there's some good handouts in your, from the previous speaker who talked about experts and went through all the procedures. But from a forensic accounting side of it, everybody talks about an expert witness in accounting. But what I found is 90% of the time, what you're presenting is facts. You're coming into court, you're telling them the facts. You're not giving an opinion. And the opinion evidence is actually very, very small. And for the most part, you would not be giving an opinion. You're just presenting the facts. You're presenting the facts on financial transactions. Okay. Just, we talked a little bit about insurance, but I just wanted to cover one thing that as a lawyer, when you get involved in employee issues, I've had a couple cases where an employee's been involved in a theft, and the company has actually kept them on, knowing that they've stolen something. And if you continue to employ a person who's committed a fraud, you're basically self-employed. And a lot of companies don't realize this. So if that person's done a fraud for even a small amount, and you keep them on as an employee, and later on they do a fraud for $100,000 or $1 million, your insurance company's going to tell you to forget it. You know, you kept them on, you knew that. So it is an issue you should do, but okay, talk about that.
This background checking service is an area that, this is a bit of an advertisement. We started up on our own firm here in the last couple of years. We do client acceptance on most of our clients, and we're background checking all the people we're hiring for PricewaterhouseCoopers. We offer this service to our clients as well. It's an area that people don't often have access to the information. It's not a costly procedure, and it can protect you and your clients or businesses from dealing with people with unsavory backgrounds. We do things like media checks, bankruptcy checks, litigation checks, those kinds of things those kinds of inquiries as a phase one background check, and then we can advance that into more sophisticated investigations. We have people that work with us all the time, and you may have them in your own firm. What I find today is it's not getting information, it's what do I do with this big pile of information? There's too much. We subscribe to some 30-plus databases plus the internet. It's key to get people to give you consistent research that consistently give you the same answer and they're going to the same resources, and know what's available for different types of circumstances. And it's an area that is not being pursued enough by most businesses. They're not checking out who they're dealing with. And they shouldn't be expected to know that information without having someone who specializes in it go and gather it for them.
What I wanted to talk about, which this case covers a lot of the things we were talking about. This was a bank in Kingston, Jamaica, and had branches throughout Jamaica. And what happened was Century National Bank became insolvent. And PricewaterhouseCoopers in Jamaica was appointed as a trustee or receiver to look after the assets and basically wind things down. Our role was to figure out what happened and why it became insolvent. And it was mostly as a litigation support. And we went through the steps of identifying what the allegations were initially, gathering documentary evidence, interviewing employees, Mariva injunction, tracing of funds, agreements, recovery of assets. Now, what I'm going to, oops. Just going to show you this case is some of the things that you could do with forensic accounting. as we started looking through this, we say, well, how did the bank develop, first of all? And you don't have these handouts, so I'll just go through this bit. This is how the company was structured on the 30th of June, 1991. So this is what was displayed eventually to the court when we went through to try and explain what happened. This is how it was a year later. And you see, here's our bank over here. Okay, so now we have a holding company. So who's behind the holding company? And what's going on with the merchant bank, the building society? We have a development company now, and we have another company going on. So then, now we're 2 years later. Whoops, something happened to my lines here. So you see, we're expanding even more. So you can see how the companies are growing. But when you start looking behind all these companies, other than the bank, the merchant bank, and the building society, which is kind of standard down there that you have all three, is now you're looking at all these other companies, and how are they starting to show up? And who's behind all these companies? Well, in the end, all these companies relate to basically three people. There was the chairman of the bank, well, the chairman of the bank and his family, his mother, his sister, his brother, and the second in charge of the bank, and the third in charge of the bank. So, and when you get to developments, Fordex, Spring, you start looking at related transactions. What was the bank doing with all the money it was taking in from depositors? Well, it was running it through the development company, and they were building all these things, which is great when real estate's going good. When real estate is not going good, then of course it crashes down. And they ran along for several years. In fact, 30th June 1994 became kind of a crunch time. And did a lot of developing, but the real estate wasn't going very well, so they had put all this money out to related parties and themselves to build things, but they had no cash coming back because they couldn't sell this stuff, so they couldn't pay back some of the loans. So as long as they had more depositors coming in and more funds coming in, they were okay. And it's kind of like a pyramid scheme, okay, where you rob Peter to pay Paul. So there's money coming in, you give it to the next person that wants to go out. So this consistently goes on. So when this wasn't going well, they developed a scheme, well, we've got to get some more money in. So they decided, well, the way to go is to sell more shares. So we're going to do a private placement of shares. But then they looked at their financial results for the 30th of June 1994. And does anybody want to invest in a company that's lost money? I don't see anybody eager. Okay. So I wouldn't. So they look at their tentative financial results, and they're not making any money. In fact, they're losing several $1 million. And in Jamaican dollars, it was something like 25 billion. It's 35 to 1 U.S. exchange now, so I have to think it's a fair amount of money. So they had to get creative. So with accounting, you become creative, and it's very easy to cause things to happen. And I'm not going to explain this because again it takes a while. I want to move on. But what they did is, I'll actually go back to this one. Through the merchant bank, they created a company called Transnational, which you see at the bottom down here. And Transnational, in turn, with a bunch of other banks, a bank from Panama and a few other places, they created a company called First Trade in the Bahamas. And they were the shareholders. Now, they didn't disclose any of this, so the line for the merchant bank you're not going to see. I put that line in there because they hid that from everybody else, how the structure worked. And then what they did is they decided that we're going to lend some money to First Trade. So they took, over a period of a year, US $25.5 million, and they put it on deposit with a company, with First Trade, and they called it term deposits. Now, term deposits, just like a GIC or something like that, when it's on your financial statement, it's very liquid. And if I look at a company and it says I have term deposits, that's something that I can consider that the bank or any other company could sell in a day and get the cash back. But what they did is they now had the money at first trade, so now they set up loans for themselves, and they gave themselves loans secured by the term deposits or time deposits, which they didn't tell anybody. So now you've got 25 million going here, and you've got 25 million going out here. But nobody told them in the bank or the auditors or anyone else that these were secured, and these would eventually or could offset each other. And I'm going to jump down here to this one, because this is actually the chart that I put in front of the court down there. And once the judge understood this, we had him. He was there. He understood what was going on. And what they did, you see the money going from CNB to First Trade, 25 million. Well, they used that. First of all, they lent 6 million of it to developments, which you saw before. Well, developments then bought property that the bank had. And one of the properties, the bank had this empty lot. And this gets into your property valuations. But they had this empty lot, which was on the books for Jamaican about $8 million, which is about $100,000 or something. And what they did is they sold it to developments for $96 million, which worked out to 3 million US dollars. So now they had a lovely capital gains, which they could put on their books for the financial statements. So now they just improved their profit by $3 million, the difference in that. But the property, it was an empty lot, totally overvalued. And they did that for 3 other properties. So you see they're now pushing up their financial statements, and they're making the picture look better. So they did this. They also sold. Has anybody been to Jamaica on holidays? There's a hotel in Ocho Rios called Jamaica Grand, which they owned. The bank owned 51% of it. It's a very nice spot. And that was owned by the merchant bank, they thought. But it got flipped over to the holding company, and they used the bank's money by doing the same thing, running the money through the Bahamas and back. Now, when they did these first two through developments and holdings, so that accounts for $22 million, they now could recreate, and they did a few other things. They did some what we call finder's fees for certain things, and they added $1 million here and they added $1 million there. And it was actually reasonably easy to find, because you looked at the last month before, the year end was 30th of June, so you looked at the last month and you looked at the transactions, and you saw all these wild transactions going on. So it was just a matter of following the transactions. Like, what the heck is this one about? Because you see, it was all hitting revenue and boosting up the bottom line of the company. So when they did that, they now had a profit. So the company is now in a profit. They're ready to put out the financial statements, which they did. So the financial statements show a good profit, but they're false. When they did the private placement to try and sell shares, nobody was interested. They still couldn't sell them. And so when we started looking at how they did the shares, and this is a very complicated transaction, but when I'm talking about displaying it, this is all you really need. Because we went through, and they formed another company called Shell Talks, which I'll just go back here. They formed this company down here called Shell Talks, and they lent that company $3.5 million. Okay? And so Shell Talks now becomes an investor in the bank. Now remember, this is still the bank's money that's sitting on there as a liquid asset. So we looked at, okay, who bought these preference shares? And we looked at, Shell Talks was responsible for 44%. There's a company called Asset Management that was them. And there's another company called Reliance Group, which they made a funny deal with to buy shares as well. It wasn't really shares, it was a loan, because they guaranteed when they bought the shares, they guaranteed to give them their money back. So, and we did have other. Now, other really represents the legitimate shareholder, or people who bought as independent buyers. So you can see where you're now getting a fraud, because there's no independence in here. Well, you had many frauds before this, but this is just another one. And we also looked at, they sold some preference shares. This one wasn't quite as bad. Others was 72%, so that was a little better. And they sold some ordinary shares, and this one's about 60%. They control Blue Cross. Blue Cross is different down there, but they control Blue Cross, which bought shares of the bank, which I could never figure out either, how they could do that. So that was, that's how you can display things. We also did financial statements to show here's what they reported, here's the adjustments that we found, and here's what they really should have read. And it becomes a very convincing argument when you go to court. They had, back to the Jamaica Grand thing, what they did is they recorded the hotel as an asset of the merchant bank for 3 years on the financial statements, but then they moved it over to the holding company, and they had a trust document which said that the merchant bank was really only holding the hotel for the holding company. And the whole purpose is they moved it over at cost, so they didn't pay, they paid $16 million, but the real value was about $30-some million. So the trust deed turned out to be fraudulent. They backdated it through a legal counsel on there. So again, all these things came forward on it. When you talk about strategy, in this case, the first time we went to court, and it was on a civil side, was that didn't want to allege fraud because they wanted to clear up who owned the bank, or who owned the hotel, because they wanted to get the hotel back so they could handle it through the receivers, and it was one of the biggest assets. So it's kind of interesting that I put in affidavits. We didn't have to testify in that, but the affidavits all dealt with strictly facts and made no allegations towards fraud. And even the counsel for the bank, when we were in court, whenever the judge kind of hinted, well, is there something on it? He said, no, we're not alleging fraud, we're not alleging, because he wanted the judge just to rule on who owned it. And it was interesting because when the judge made his decision, in a written decision, he went all the way through and he said, yes, the bank really owns a hotel and all this, and the trust deed is fake. And at the end he said, and all of this is a fraudulent transaction. So it helped when we went to the next civil case, and when this went to court, did in fact win a judgment against them. Also used Mariva injunctions become very important, and this was an example, and you can use Mariva injunctions worldwide if you can get in the right court jurisdiction. But what a Mariva injunction is, it allows you to freeze an asset. And in this case, and several others I've used, if you know somebody's got an asset, you think they're going to dispose of it, it's related to your company. Now, it can be either directly related, so in other words, you've got money going out of your company, or by a fraudulent transaction which directly went to buy that asset, or it's indirectly related in the fact that you're missing money and this person has an asset out there. You can put for the court and ask for a Mariva injunction. And what it does is it freezes the asset until all these things are dealt with. In this case, the chairman of the bank left or was dismissed from it. He was dealing with a legal counsel in the United States. And I guess the secretary for the legal counsel didn't quite understand that he was no longer at the bank, because we would sit in his office and the fax machine faxes would come in and then say, oh, the $1 million that's sitting in this account, as per your instructions, we've moved this over to our account at such and such. And there's 2 faxes like this. So I guess I felt guilty not phoning and saying that, you should send this to the appropriate number. Instead, this became the basis for our Mariva injunction and went over and froze those funds, along with several others. We identified a couple houses in Atlanta that they had bought, funds and other bank accounts and things like that. And when you have a Mariba injunction, you have the funds frozen, you get a different response from the other side, because they now know that you've got their money tied up, so they're not going to be able to live off the proceeds while they try and drag all these procedures out. This also became, this has also resulted in a criminal investigation, which I don't know at this stage where it stands. But that's just an example I wanted to go through with you. There's some of the other things that you might use in a forensic accountant. I talked a bit about fidelity insurance investigations. And the standard accounting, you get an individual that's involved in an accident, as an example, and of course they have a claim for lost income or something of that nature. And in one case, the claimant's accountant and lawyer produced a report which they calculated as future income, and kind of goes back to what the fellow at the back was talking about there, is that they decided that his future earnings was $400,000, and this is a report. It was based on some of the documents that he had and things like that. And he was involved in a small fender bender on Don Valley, and he did have an injury, and I don't think that was the issue. Now, we were asked by legal counsel for the insurance company to go through this. Now, one aspect of it was the accounting, and looking through and say, okay, let's look at the invoices, let's look at things, what is his revenue, what are his expenses, and things like that. But on the investigative side, we were asked to get involved and look at it as well. Now, this is where you come into, well, what's really going on in this company? And both Ray and I started with the RCMP in the bankruptcy section. So we looked at bankruptcies and things like that. And so you start looking and say, well, up to this date, he was doing this. But he's a contractor in construction. So you don't just finish a contract and then go and find the next one. You always have 3 or 4 or 5 in abeyance, so you're ready to go, because you can't afford to be spending time to find a new job. This guy had none. So we went back and we interviewed some of the people that had hired him, and he was actually working for a franchise. He was doing all the franchise, setting up the restaurants for the franchisees. And we interviewed a series of them, and they all said they'd never hire him again. And in fact, the franchise company had taken him off the list because his work was so poor, and he was basically on the last job that he was ever going to get. And in fact, he hadn't even finished that one. So in the end, we were able to show that he had no future income. He was bankrupt. His company was bankrupt. There was no future income. Took this back to legal counsel. Legal counsel says that we're going to give him 0. So now we've got $400,000 here, and we got 0 down here. And in the end, I believe what legal counsel said as well, rather than save a trial, we'll give him $20,000 and let's get it out of here. So really, it probably covered his legal costs, and that was about it. So you can see the difference between accounting and taking the next step on forensic investigations. So it takes it one step farther. Got in here secret commissions and kickbacks, and these are always interesting, because when you're looking at this, the real evidence for a kickback is in the records of the person paying the kickback. So it's not necessarily in the company that you're either working with or doing the investigation with. So it's a little difficult to get at those records, but there are other ways. And a lot of these things tend to originate by such things as anonymous fax. And I had one case where a company got anonymous fax. It was alleging that the procurement manager was taking kickbacks. And it was such a situation that this guy was about to retire in 3 months. He'd been a good employee of the company, and all of a sudden you have this allegation. So now we're getting into these employment issues. And what do you do in something like that? Like, do you rush in and haul this guy in and say, hey, we think you're taking kickbacks and all of this, and now you've got a 25-year employee that's going out the door under these circumstances. Now, in this case, what we did is we actually did an investigation, and to my knowledge to this day, this guy still doesn't know we did an investigation, because we looked at the various contracts, and we used internal audit. We said, okay, you go as an internal audit, which is part of your standard procedures, you look at certain contracts which were let. And he went in and he actually brought the contracts back to us, and then we went through them and looked for various things and various signs of kickbacks. We looked at his lifestyle. We looked at a series of other things, and in the end, we were satisfied that he was not taking kickbacks. He was not involved in this because his signatures weren't on it. We looked at the way the contracts were let, and it really turned out, and I found out later, that this actually came back, this fax originated from a company who had not, or an individual of a company who had not gotten certain contracts, so he was just upset. So that's an example of where, in fact, you're really proving that nothing happened, and you haven't disrupted, the employee retires, everybody's happy, and away it goes. Now, in a lot of other cases, there is a kickback, and I just did one where we were doing a company, and it was just on inventory. The inventory didn't exist, but you could follow through all the invoices, the purchase orders, and things like that. And once you sort it out and you start seeing what's happening, you'll see that a purchase order predates an invoice and things like that. And again, you add it up, it's only $1,000, but this ended up about $700,000 over about 3 years, all inventory for parts that never arrived. With financial statements, and just have a couple minutes here, financial statement fraud is probably what occurs the easiest of anything, because you can do so much on a financial statement that is just creative accounting. And it's a matter of, show you a little example here. If we treat each one of these as a fiscal year, okay, and a fiscal year, whatever the company has. So if I get revenue in this year, I'm supposed to account for the expenses in this year as well. So in other words, if I sell something for $1,000, but it costs me $800 to make that, well, then I should report a profit of $200. But instead, I report $1,000, and I put my expenses over in this period. So by just a timing issue, you've now improved your financial statements. Now, the problem that happens, of course, is now you have an extra $80 in expenses in this year. So when I go to this year, what am I going to do? So maybe I'll move it to this year. So eventually, all of this starts to catch up, and this is how the numbers can grow. And next thing you know, you end up with $100 million. And you can do it with inventory. You can play with inventory. You can move it from period to period. You can be so creative in financial statement fraud. It's so easy to make money. Instead of expenses, like I have, for instance, maybe I'm supposed to pay back a loan. I've got a $3 million loan that's supposed to be paid back, so that's cash out of my company. Well, instead of paying it as an expense and returning the funds, I decided to capitalize that payment. So now I've stuck it on the balance sheet, and it's no longer an expense. I've improved with one simple transaction, I've improved my company's return by $3 million. Foreign exchange. I talked to you about derivatives. How many people understand foreign exchange? How many don't understand foreign exchange? I know one of the two. And again, it's so easy to be creative. I looked at a company that they were doing things in US dollars and Canadian dollars. And to repay certain things, like a normal rate would say a conversion is 1.5. Well, they were setting up director loans and related party loans. Well, instead of recording it at the market rate or a rate they should have, they would record it, for instance, at 1.2 or something. So they would take a loan from the company in US dollars, record it in the account at Canadian dollars at 1.2, and they've made the difference. So on $1 million, they've made $300,000 just like that. And when they repay it, they use a higher rate. So it's very easy. And it all gets buried in foreign exchange because it all goes to a foreign exchange account, and a lot of times nobody looks at it and says, oh, it's just foreign exchange. So those are some examples. We're at 12:30. Any questions or else you could cover? We try to cover a lot of things in an hour and a half. We've hit what you need. There's charts in here. Oh, I put some things in here. This is more related to individual frauds, just for your benefit. Actually, I need to cover my rule of thumb because I like asking people on this. So you just bear with me for a minute. The center one didn't print out, and I'm not sure why. But okay, there's a rule of thumb, and this is not based on any statistical analysis or anything else like that. But when you look at that round pie chart, 20% of the people are honest, 20% of the people are dishonest, and the rest are somewhere in the middle. Okay, so the other 6%. And I've seen this 10, 10, and 80, and various amounts. So if you look at yourself right now, and I want people to be honest, who would put themselves in the 20% that are totally honest? Okay. Who would put themselves in the 20% that are totally dishonest? I'm looking. Okay, so everybody else is kind of in the middle. And actually, the first time I was asked this, I put myself in the 20% that are totally honest. So if we look at the next page, and we look at a thing that's called opportunity, motivation, and rationalization. And this is really a very, very simple fraud theory. But first of all, you need the opportunity. And I would say that most people in this room, and certainly myself, have the opportunity every day. Whether it's on your expense account, whether it's dealing with other people's money or doing all these things, you have the opportunity. Now, it becomes in a motivation. So something happens in your life, a crisis. You know, you have the obvious things: drugs, gambling, divorce, things like that. Maybe a child's sick. All things that lead to motivation. And then you have the rationalization that say, well, it's okay for me to take that. So when you have those three things working, and maybe it's because, hey, I didn't get the promotion in the company because Ray got it and I'm better than him, but so now I have a rationalization to do this. So when you go back and you look at the chart and you say, okay, I first put myself in 20% as totally honest. But then when I started thinking about it, well, I've never really, I've always had the opportunity, but I've never had the motivation, and I never had the rationalization. Now, if I ever do have those two, then I would end up in the category that could commit a fraud if I had those three. So in other words, I'm in the 60% category. So it's something to think about. So are we all still in the 20% honest? Okay. Thank you very much. Let's come here. Thanks, sir.